Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on a just transition, making climate action inclusive. My name is Shannon Rohan, and I am the Chief Strategy Officer at the Shareholder Association for Research and Education. And I'm grateful to be joining all of you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Today's webinar will be running for 1 hour and 15 minutes. You will be in listen mode throughout the webinar. We've reserved the last 15 minutes for questions. And you can submit your questions in two ways. One is through the chat box function, which you see at the bottom right-hand side of the webinar panel. And we encourage you to post your questions throughout the webinar to help us just manage them and get them into the queue. You're also going to be able to ask questions via the raise your hand function, and we will unmute your microphone and you can ask your questions that way, and we hope that'll give us a chance to hear from more of you on the line and have as interactive as a discussion as we can on this webinar. Just so you know, the webinar is being recorded, and so we will share the recording with everyone registered, and it will also be accessible through the Foundation Investing 2.0 webpage on SHARE's website. So for those of you who have organized webinars or spoken on webinars before, it sometimes feels like you're sort of speaking out there into a void. So we've done a couple of things to try to help that. One is to have a video feed of the speakers so you can actually see them and see each other. And the second is we wanted to give everybody a chance to actually just say hello or bonjour or welcome from wherever you are today across Canada. We also have participation here internationally. So we are actually going to unmute everyone's microphones this morning and give you all a chance to say hi. So I'm just going to ensure that we're all set to go from my colleague here. And Damon, are we all good? And if we can then
you may have to unmute yourself, though.
If people are unmuted, there's a microphone button there. If you can unmute that and say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If everyone can say good morning.
Good morning.
Or good afternoon.
Good morning.
Good afternoon.
As you can see, I'm on the West Coast, I apologize. So it is morning here, but I know it's afternoon and evening for some of those joining us. So that was fun, thank you. It was great just to hear that there are actually a lot of folks on this call, and we're really happy to have such a good turnout here today. So I wanted to start just briefly by giving you a background about Foundation Investing 2.0. This is an initiative of the Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Network, Community Foundations of Canada, Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, and the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada. And it's being implemented by SHARE together with Rally Philanthropy. And so the project is really aiming to help Canadian foundations implement more and better impact and responsible investing strategies across their endowment portfolios. And the project is really designed for foundation board members, trustees, investment committee members, CEOs, executive directors, and staff. And we're really seeking to support them wherever they might be on the journey. And so through that initiative, we're delivering webinars such as this, and we're also developing tools and resources and hosting in-person events. And so we're really excited that you're joining us today and invite you to really get involved throughout this work and the various events that we're putting on. In terms of the agenda today, we're giving a brief introduction, and we really want to go very quickly into our panel discussion. We have an excellent group of speakers, and I'm very grateful for their participation. Vonda, Brunsting, Colin, Baines, and Nancy Neamtan, who we will be introducing in a few minutes. We will then be moving into question and answers and hopefully have a lot of questions and interaction for the speakers during that time. And finally, we'll be just providing some closing remarks and letting you know some upcoming events you might be interested in. It's quite fitting that the webinar is being held today on the 10th anniversary of the World Day for Decent Work. And decent work, I think, is really the kind of work that we all aspire to have. It's work that's productive, it delivers a fair income, it can provide security in the workplace, but also social protection for our families and our communities. Decent work is really about providing better prospects for personal development and social integration. It's about freedom of people to express their concerns, to organize, and to participate in the decisions that are affecting their working lives. And it's also about equal opportunity for all people. And so we were quite intentional about holding this webinar on just transition today, so that we can remember, you know, the role that decent work and our thinking about decent work really needs to play as we're thinking about just transition. And I think at the end of the day, we have an enormous opportunity here in Canada, but also internationally, when we think about the large-scale transformation that our economies will need to undertake in order to meet the Paris Agreement commitments, to ensure that those transitions are made with the workers and communities at the center. But we need to be intentional about including people in our transition plans, and we need to be explicit about incorporating decent work into broader commitments relating to transitioning our economies locally, regionally, and nationally. So what do we mean by just transition? According to the International Trade Union Confederation, just transition is really an economy-wide process that produces the plans, policies, and investments that lead to a future where all jobs are green and decent, emissions are at net zero, poverty is eradicated, and communities are thriving and resilient. So that's the definition that is provided by the ITUC. And I think it's also important to note that just transition is also included in the preamble to the Paris Agreement, and which calls on the parties to agreement to take into account the imperative of a just transition of the workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. And so those are really the definitions. That is what we're talking about. I think it's really important to emphasize the aspect of an economy-wide process. And although this may sound abstract, I think the conversations that we'll be hearing and the examples that will be provided to us by our panel will show that really this is not an abstract concept. At Share, for example, we have been engaging with Canadian and US utilities companies, asking about their plans to help transition workers and communities in the context of closing down coal-fired plants, for example. And at one company, those conversations led to a commitment from the company that all of its employees at the coal-fired operations would be offered new employment at the new facilities with at least the same pay, the same benefits, the same pensions, the same seniority, as well as a relocation package. And that resulted in 376 out of the 400 workers accepting that offer. So while, you know, this is a high-arching framework, this certainly isn't just an abstract concept, and there are ways for us to make it practical. So I just want to check to see if Andrea is here with us. Andrea, oh, you are, okay. That's great. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrea Neamtan from the Rally Philanthropy to introduce our speakers and to get us started with our panel discussion.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Shannon. Thank you so much, and it's great to be here. I'm not quite sure if I'm supposed to be sharing my webcam or the slides, so let me just see. What are you seeing there? Oh, I can't hear you. Okay.
We're looking. I can run them from here if you want.
Thanks. That's okay. I can pull them up. Just one second, or if you'd like to go for it. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We've got three really interesting and experienced and really inspiring individuals to talk to us about their experience with just transition. And I'm going to start introducing Nancy Neamtan, who we know of. I've just got a little thing coming up. Is everything okay? Yeah, screenshot. Is this okay? So we've got Nancy Neamtan is going to start us off, and Nancy is a strategic advisor at Chantier de l'économie sociale. So the Chantier is well known in Canada amongst social enterprise circles. And let me just pull you guys up for 1 second. And Nancy was really one of the founders of it. And Chantier is a network of networks of collective enterprises, local and regional development organizations, social movements, youth, First Nations, researchers, and others interested in promoting and developing the social economy. And Nancy's going to share with us a little bit about her experience in Quebec and the Quebec experience and how that can be applied to the Canadian and broader context. And then we also have Colin Baines from Friends Provident Foundation. Hi, Colin. And Colin didn't actually have a title on his website. I can tell you what he does. He's responsible for integrating the foundation's endowment with its mission, including using it as a tool to bring about change. And this is quite a large job. Their mission is actually to help create a fair economy, better world. Our strategy contributes to the delivery of this mission in 3 ways: grants, managing their investments, and their power to convene and communicate. And then lastly but not least, we have Vonda Brunsting, who's here from the Institute for Responsible Investment at Harvard. And Vonda is the program manager at the Just Transition Project. And she's going to be talking to us a little bit about their experience and the framework through which that's been developed in terms of how organizations can actually move towards more of a through the just transition, and specifically some specific levers. I'd like to also point out that Vonda was one of the co-writers on a guidebook, which is Investing in Just Transitions: Why Investors Need to Integrate a Social Dimension into Their Climate Strategies and How They Would Take Action. And we'll be sharing that link with you at the end and in our email sending you out today. And so I'm going to start off with Vonda, and we'll just change the slide to the next slide there. So I'll tell you a little bit about the just transition, and then I'm going to hand it over to Vonda to talk to us a little bit about the 4 levers of strategy and some ideas on the first steps that others can take, and what are some of the essential elements for success and barriers that people have faced. So first, I'm going to do a very quick introduction. The Just Transition, it started in February of 2018, and the project will link investors to the broad array of policy-based community labor and business efforts to deliver a just transition and explore ways of empowering community and labor groups to effectively engage with investors. It will provide a resource for leading investor initiatives and will lay the foundations for a long-term action by investors and others to ensure that the climate transition contributes to the wider sustainable development goals. I think this is really, I think that just to sort of take a few steps back, really what we want to do, what we're all here and what everyone here is thinking about is how do we transition without in a way that people do not, where the prices that it's going to be paid are equitably distributed. At a global level, the project will undertake 3 main initiatives or activities. And I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to Vonda to tell us a little bit more about the project. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Sorry, and hand it over to Vonda. Hi, Vonda. Not sure if we can hear you just yet. Damon, can we unmute Vonda?
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you are.
Okay, great. Okay.
Great.
So why don't I start by talking a little bit about our project. That's the slide for people who can see it on the screen. And just let the folks who are listening in know how it came about. So I am now, as Andrea said, working at the Harvard Initiative for Responsible Investment. But up until a year or so ago, I was working for the Service Employees International Union, a labor union that's based in the US and represents about 2 million workers in the US and Canada and Puerto Rico. And I worked in our capital stewardship program. So I worked in and around our pension funds. And in that role, I spent probably 10 years working on corporate governance related matters, including ESG issues, the environmental, social, and governance factors that impact our investments. And the E of the ESG had really been very well developed. I would say there's more work to be done, but yet we, with other investors, were filing shareholder resolutions, looking at our own carbon footprint, as well as our assets in our portfolio, and really collaborating to try to figure out what the role of investors in climate would be and the risk in our portfolio and how to address that. And very little attention was being paid about the social dimension. And so I, at the same time, was sort of struggling with how to bring the workers into the debates around climate change for investors. I met Nick Robbins, and Nick and I ended up starting this project. He's located at the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics, and then I moved over to the Initiative for Responsible Investment, as I mentioned. And we both felt that given the political environment 2 years ago, post 2016 for me in the US and Brexit for Nick in the UK, and other things that were happening in the world, that for us to not consider the social dimension would not only, for me coming out of the labor movement, was I find it a challenge, but also we weren't going to get there on our climate goals if we didn't address this issue. And I had my own personal experience with transitions, having grown up in Michigan in what is known in the US as the Rust Belt, and having experienced as a child growing up in the 70s and 80s, really the transition that didn't happen as the work all moved south. My family all worked in the automotive industry and factories, and the struggle that my relatives, my father, my family had, as there was no account made for the workers as our economy shifted. So that driving me, my own personal history, as well as my years of working in the labor movement, and then my experience working with investors, we then began to look at why should investors take action on the just transition, and then started this effort to really support investors to do that. So I think you can move to the next slide. What we found as we started discussing this with investors was that there was a lot of agreement that there should be something done. I think there was a lot of interest in trying to pick up the social dimension. We then wrote a couple of papers, which Andrea mentioned in her introduction, which we will share out. One, a discussion paper to look at what could the role of investors be, and then we launched a toolkit last December. And really, this we see as a complement to the action that governments are taking on the just transition. In Canada, your government has made great strides in, well, I guess you can decide if it's great strides or not. But I know that there's been a task force set up for coal communities. Other governments are picking up the just transition. Certainly the trade unions have been trying to look at this issue across the globe. as well as local frontline communities in the US and other places. We've seen a lot of action. But what within that is the role of investors? That was sort of our challenge. We wrote these guides. We've been talking to investors for about 1.5 years. And then we sent out a statement for investors to sign on to if they wanted to really work with us on this challenge. And we got a tremendous amount of support. We launched, as it says on the screen, this guide, the toolkit rather, with the investors who said, yes, let's work on this at COP24 last year. And it was backed by 140 institutions with $8 trillion in assets. So that leads us to really great. There's folks who want to help us figure it out. We can work on this together, but what do we do? So you can move to the next slide. So we came up with 5 action steps that you can take. Obviously, there's probably many more, and we don't have to take on all of them, but we were really looking at how we might build on work that investors are already doing in their portfolios around ESG issues and experiences that people had. Shannon mentioned in the beginning about Share's work on engaging companies on the just transition. Other investors globally have been picking up this issue for a couple of years, and we felt like lifting up some examples and then digging in on areas that we might collaborate would be a good way forward. And so I'm just going to give a couple of examples in maybe a couple of minutes, and then I'm happy to answer more questions as we come to it. So the first place that we felt we could work, and you can move to the next slide, I'll go through each of these really briefly, is investment strategy. And just to give an example of what one investor has done, the French public sector fund Ircantec has actually integrated not necessarily the language just transition, but the concept in their investment policy statement. And they talk about this in terms of intergenerational solidarity and equity, and seeking through their investments not only to optimize financial capital and the payment of pensions, but also to preserve the environmental and social capital that contributes to social progress and the development of a sustainable economy. And so it just felt to me like that's what we're aiming for, and they've embodied that by putting it right into their investment policy statement. And then the second one that I have listed is investor engagement, and this one we felt like is probably the area that a lot of investors feel most comfortable, because those of us who are shareholders have been engaging with companies for a long time, and how we then use similar strategies to pick up the agenda around the just transition. So in addition to the work that I do at Harvard, I serve on the board of Share, as well as on the investment committee of the UU Common Endowment Fund. And in my experience as a board member and investment committee member, I've been part of a lot of shareholder dialogues, and in fact, on climate resolutions in particular. So I felt like this is a place that we could pick up something that people already do and then add into it issues around the just transition. And really it's folding together 2 main components of the work that Share does, work on climate as well as decent work, and joining them up. So we're there at List Climate Action 100 Plus as another way of us moving this. Again, a global effort. I can share more with people offline, or you can look it up if you don't know about it, but really an effort of investors to collaborate to do shareholder engagement. The just transition is in their focus, and we are now working with them on how to really manage that and implement that through their shareholder engagement process. So the third thing, really quickly, is capital allocation. And here, as investors, we have a lot of power to look at how we deploy capital, look at the opportunities that we have. And again, a lot of work has been done, particularly investments in the renewable sector. And one announcement to bring into the discussion today from 2 weeks ago during Climate Week around the UN's efforts, the Danish private pension funds announced that they were pledging to invest more than $50 billion in the next, I think, 10 years in green assets. So that includes energy infrastructure, green stocks and bonds, and energy efficient construction. So huge steps, bold actions, a lot of capital. We don't have to go that big, but there's lots of ways we can do this. And then just briefly, we also believe that the just transition is going to be really driven by governments and policymakers. Nonetheless, there is a role for investors in those policy debates, and it may not be the place that we feel as comfortable as we do engaging with shareholders, but we need to be at those tables as well. And so we're in the middle of doing some dialogues where we're trying to bring together shareholders, investors, companies with workers and impacted communities along with policymakers, because we believe that this work has to be done in collaboration, but really in place in localities that are struggling with how to do the transition in a geographic area and also in sector. And so we're starting with the utility companies, which perhaps Colin will talk a little bit more about their experience in the UK. So I think there's probably another slide. I'm not going to go through that last slide. I don't think we have time, but there's my contact information, and I'm happy to chat more now and in the discussion to come. Thanks.
Thanks, Vonda. That was fantastic. And so just to sort of summarize, it sounds like your organization, $8 trillion worth of investors, is quite substantial and quite influential. And just what I heard from the takeaways in terms of what asset owners can do, there was a sort of an institutionalization of your intent, so that incorporating the values into the actual investment policy statement is a powerful and a legacy piece that people can do, and that things can flow from that. Sounds like institutions and asset owners can use their influence as shareholders and do that in a holistic way to make sure that those corporations and organizations and projects they're influencing realize that it's not climate or social issues. It needs to be both. They can actually invest, so shift capital. So actually somehow that would mean obviously incorporating these principles into their investment decisions, which I assume would flow through from the IPS. And then also to continue that influence in a policy context and in context outside of the shareholder context. Is that?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, sure.
That's fantastic. And what have you, I'm just going to ask you very quickly, what have you seen in terms of organizations facing barriers to this? What is holding, you've had a huge upsurge in support and participation. What have been the things that may have stopped people from participating? And can you just give me maybe one example of someone having faced a barrier and maybe surmounted it?
Well, I guess I'll just say the first thing that comes to mind, which is a meeting I was at yesterday, a conference where we were discussing this, and we had a discussion, again, this was in the US, about the challenges with working between labor and capital. And it kind of goes back to Shannon's introduction, or maybe yours, Andrea, about the burden and the cost of the transition. And this, I guess, feeling that there's a set of winners and losers. And I'm just sort of struck by, you know, that especially in the US, antagonism between, you know, the workforce and companies. And I think that that is a place that for us here, we have to get past and sort of see there being a way to work together to figure out how there could be maybe a shared understanding and you know, not looking at a sort of a set of winners and losers. I guess that's what I would say. And I think that for the just the folks that have moved through that, I think it's really done through almost not face to face, but in real time, not in abstractions. So I'm just thinking of a shareholder in the US who's been working with a utility company and just really talking with them over and over again and bringing workers' voices in and bringing impacted communities in and doing that hard work, I think is not something that investors always see themselves as being part of, but that's a barrier, but I think it's also something that we can get through, especially if we support one another.
I think that's, thank you, Vonda. That's a really perfect segue for us to actually transition to hear a little bit about Colin, about your experience as an investor who's committed to the just transition. And I'm going to hand my mic over to Shannon, who's going to lead us through your slides and your conversation, what you can share with us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Vonda. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I think it is an excellent segue to look at the role that the Friends Provident Foundation is playing in the UK. And I was really pleased, Colin, that you were able to join us today. And perhaps just to start out, many on the call will not be familiar with the Friends Provident Foundation. So can you tell us a little bit about the foundation and the work that you do, and particularly your approach to investing the foundation's endowment?
Sure. Thanks for having us. Welcome. I'm in Edinburgh at the moment.
Oh, lovely.
Early evening over here. Friends Provident Foundation is a capitalised charity foundation. Our mission is a firm and sustainable economic system. So, you know, I don't know what I'm going to do in 2 weeks' time. We've done that. But we like to aim high. So we take an integrated approach to our mission and capital. And historically, we've been a grant-making charity. I've been at the organisation for 3 years now. And my role was created to align the endowment with our mission. So I'm primarily doing asset manager engagement around ESG standards, responsible investment standards. We do direct shareholder engagement with both direct investee companies and also the underlying companies in our sort of pool funds with those larger ESG funds. And then we have a 10% carve out of our endowment for direct impact investing as well. So we will seek out the solutions often at an early stage. We're very happy to accept a higher risk or a lower return if we get a higher social and environmental return on those investments. That's the approach that we take, and that's basically what I spend my day doing.
Excellent, Colin. When we spoke on the phone a few weeks ago, you talked about the 3D framework that you apply to your just transition work, and I thought that was really, really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that framework is and how the work you're doing to accelerate these 3Ds through your investments?
Sure. We've been engaging with the energy utility market for about 2 years. We choose a small number of sort of thematic priorities, because obviously a fair and sustainable economic system is quite big. So we break it down a bit, and we've taken the energy market as an initial priority. The 3D energy transition, as we frame it, is about the trend that is happening already to a decarbonised, decentralised and increasingly democratised energy system. Most of the engagement that is happening is focused purely on decarbonisation and climate risk. But actually the market faces much larger, perhaps complicated risks than that, driven primarily by the huge shifts that have happened in technology and in the economics of smaller scale renewable energy, battery storage, technologies coming along around demand management, smart appliances. All of this is undermining the current business model of most of the energy utilities, which historically have been about large, centralized, dirty electricity generation, and then inefficient long distance transmission, And then at the end of the wires, passive consumers that are just getting what they're given. Now, with the engagement that we've been doing with the energy utilities, virtually all of them, except that those days are gone. Increasingly, energy users are active participants in the energy market. So, of course, there are more rooftop solar, more communities to scale renewables, there's more business doing on-site generation. Like I said, battery power is getting cheaper and more easily accessible. And then demand management and lots of new entrants. Even car manufacturers are now moving into the energy market, with electric vehicles also acting as battery to back up your household energy use on the drive. So it's a real period of massive disruption within the sector, and one that both the utility companies themselves and investors need to grapple with as a whole. And this actually gives you the opportunity, like Vonda was saying, to integrate the social dimension into our shareholder engagement, and also on our capital allocation side as well. So we've been engaging with those 6 large priority UK companies, examining their business model resilience to these trends, how they are lobbying actually, because we found a lot of them are using their influence with the regulators and legislators to prop up the current model, which is indicative that they're not actually, you can't do that forever, and it's actually indicative that they're not preparing for the long term. So we're using that as a proxy to judge whether they are acting responsibly and they are actually preparing for this massive disruption in the sector. And then the just transition aspect to it as well. So we were engaging for 2 years. I'm also on the advisory group to the LSE work that Vonda mentioned. And since that started producing recommendations, we've been incorporating those recommendations straight into our engagement. And so our engagement's one strand of our work, and the other is direct impact investing in community energy projects, which we see as playing a vital role in this, because more often than not, those projects, those community scale renewables that are perhaps cooperatives or community interest companies, are legally obliged to operate for the benefit of the community. A lot of them operate for the purpose of reducing local fuel poverty. So it's a great way actually of making sure that nobody or no communities are left behind by this transition. Because one of the risks, of course, is that more people leave the grid because they have solar and storage, they're more likely to be the wealthier energy consumers. And that leaves poorer fuel poverty, people in fuel poverty, to actually pick up the accumulating grid costs and sort of making that problem worse. So community energy is a way of making sure that no communities are left behind, nobody's left behind. There's been a lot of, for many years now, I guess there's been a lot of focus on stranded asset risk for investors. Well, this work is now bringing in the issues of stranded communities and stranded people and consumers and workers as well. These are all important sort of strands to that work.
That's brilliant, Colin, and really inspiring, particularly how the foundation has obviously looked at this across its portfolio, so not exclusively in one asset class and not exclusively in one dimension of that and of the transition. So not only at decarbonization, but also just the fact that you're also looking at accessibility, community accessibility to the grid and the new energy system, and what that looks like at a local level. Can you talk a bit about, I mean, you spoke about the engagement with UK energy utilities, and you spoke about your capital allocation side of things in terms of the impact investing in community energy projects. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what some of the challenges have been in either of those, either in terms of the engagement with the energy utilities companies, or on the impact investing side. A couple of challenges that you've faced, and perhaps briefly how you've tried to address those. I think those on the call are probably, maybe facing some of the similar challenges. So just giving us a sense of how you've worked through some of those would be really helpful.
Okay. If you click to the next slide. Could have brought this one up earlier, actually.
Oh, sorry.
Just click back. So that's a slide that's from the LSE work. Vonda's going to circulate those reports, you can find that. But that captures quite nicely, actually, the different dimensions of the just transition. So, of course, it's about workers in those large centralized plants. It's also about the communities that surround them. It's about those consumers that are at risk of being left behind on the grid. And it's about citizens and the sort of policy frameworks and that type of thing that actually make the whole thing tick. Before I just move on to the next slide and some of the challenges and stuff, probably an opportune moment just to actually mention that this isn't an issue we have over here, but I imagine it's one for you guys in Canada. Is on the citizen side is the frontline First Nation communities. So over here we're looking at gas plants, we're looking at coal-fired power stations, what's left of the coal mining industry. But actually, if I think about Canada, the first thing that springs to mind for me is the tar sands, being, one of the most carbon-intensive fuels on the planet. Is going to be also one of the most capital-intensive. It's going to be one of the first to actually get wound down as we move to a net zero, low-carbon economy. And those communities on the front line are highly likely to be left behind with a horrendous toxic legacy within their traditional territories, and at the same time a loss of jobs, a loss of sort of local income stream. I imagine that's going to be a big issue under that citizen sort of bunch of this transition for you guys. I just thought how much people have given that side of things much thought, actually. But if we go to the next slide.
Can you see that there, Colin?
Great, thanks. So if we take just one of the utility companies that we've been engaging with, it's France's EDF. Now, they are primarily operating nuclear plant, but they've had some coal and they've got a couple of gas as well. So they're very much of the centralized top-down model. We've been engaging with them across a range of issues. Now, these are probably the ones that have responded best to us. They had, this summer, they closed a coal-fired power station in Cotton. They have plans to close another one within the next year. And they also have about 6 or 7 nuclear plants that will be getting closed in the next few years as well, which actually, even though it's not about low carbon transition, those communities and those workers are still facing the same issues. So we've been talking to them about how they are taking forward their worker and community relations, how they are redeploying and retraining the workers that are currently working in the coal plants. What are their plans for when those coal plants close? We're very keen to see site reuse from a community perspective. There's lots of assets in place already. So, for instance, if you close down a coal-fired power station, you've got, and it was to be demolished, you've got a big flat site that is already at the centre of the national grid infrastructure, which would lend itself to other energy infrastructure. We've been encouraging them to look at things like mega battery plants and large solar arrays on those sites. And then there's the community reinvestment as well. So they're not just going to up sticks, we hope, and leave those communities in the lurch. Actually, they are reinvested and they are looking to new jobs, new good quality jobs into those areas, rather than leave them high and dry. Now, EDF have responded very well to that engagement. They've committed to adhering to just transition principles in all the large plant closure programs. They've already started talking to the unions. They're already looking at worker redeployment, and they are keen to carry on the conversation around the community side of things. So we're really pleased with how that's gone. They've also been doing an R&D pilot called Project Community, which is putting the first sort of toe into the water of community energy and small-scale renewables, battery storage, demand management, etc. So they have an R&D pilot around local energy, providing social housing residents with electricity from local community-owned solar and storage, using peer-to-peer trading and blockchain technology to do this local scale energy market, which we love. I think that's going to be a big part of a future 3D energy system. So again, we've been encouraging them to roll out that nationally. And that takes the community and consumer dimensions of the just transition as well. So we're very pleased in how that's gone. In terms of what challenges we've faced.
Colin, maybe just in 1 minute, if you can talk about that, okay. And then we can also come back to it in the questions, just so we, yeah.
Well, one big challenge has been either them not wishing to talk about plant closure that they've got, that we know they're probably planning, but they don't want to put that out into the public domain. That's been a challenge. And also it's been a challenge that some of them know they have this privileged position with the regulators. They're often inside government writing the rules themselves, but they believe they can prop up a centralized model and they can keep undermining the 3D transition. But it is everyone sensible in the sector would say you can only do that for so long. The economics are in favour of the 3D transition to such an extent that you can only basically capture the regulators and prop up this system for so long. And actually, it's in their interest to be first movers, because as I mentioned early on, demand's going to drop for large centralised plant. So the ones that move soonest will be the most resilient to that transition, and they'll be the most likely to come out the other end okay. There are going to be losers, and those that try to fight it probably are going to be the ones that lose, along with their communities and their workers.
Okay, thank you, Colin. That's brilliant. And I'm going to hand it over to Andrea to chat with Nancy.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Colin. It was great to hear the story of a foundation that's really working on the front lines of trying to affect this. And it's my pleasure. Now we're going to hand it over to Nancy, who's going to talk a little bit about really what has been happening here in Quebec and in Canada. And Nancy, I think you're probably one of the most important voices in Canada related to the social economy. So this is sort of much, went quite broad, and then we went in a little bit, and now we're going to go quite broad again, because I know that we're moving from the investor broad strokes perspective to one specific investor. And now when we're looking at the social economy, it's not just the investors, but the social entrepreneurs at the other end, and the community development organizations, and the whole consortium or confluence of organizations that are required to work together. And so, Nancy, let me hand it over to you to talk to us a little bit about, we'll go to your first slide, Chantier and the social economy model that you've been following, and the movement. Really tell us a little bit about the movement.
Yeah, well, I guess, it's interesting because we're really coming at this discussion from a perspective of investors, of a foundation, and I'm coming at from a civil society. I started working in the poorest neighborhood in Canada in the early 80s, the beginning of Reaganomics, where they said the trickle-down effect and everything was going to trickle down, and then we just had to get out of the way. And of course, we didn't believe them, and we were right. So the whole issue of changing the economic logic in which development is taking place has been the heart of what we call the social movement, economy movement in Quebec, or what we would also call movement for economic democratization. And now in the new vocabulary, we talk a lot about a just transition. So what we've been working on for many years, and really building from the bottom up, from community up, from the labor movement, is a very broad coalition that is trying to develop and really, our organization, which is a coalition of all these different organizations, is to change the very logic of economic development. If we listen to GX, experts on climate change, that's what they're saying too, is that we're not going to get to the bottom of this problem and really solve it if we continue to work in the dominant economic model, where, as we all know, those who detain capital and control capital decide how development takes place. And our perspective has always been that those who are doing development in communities, those who are doing, should be the ones who decide how development takes place in response to the needs and aspirations of communities, and to a certain extent also on where, I guess, the particularity of the social economy movement versus other movements in other places is we very much put a lot of emphasis on the whole notion of collective ownership, collective enterprise, land trust, all the different forms of enterprises that are within the economy but are working on another logic other than maximizing shareholder investment. So slowly we've been coming from a movement perspective closer and closer to what we're hearing from Vonda, what we're hearing from Colin, of how do we get this together. And that's why we talk a lot about and I guess the one thing that we've learned is the importance of an ecosystem approach, that if we for example, we've had investors that are interested, we have labor pension funds, our labor movement in Quebec, at the same time as we started to do community economic development and social economy and start questioning that economic logic, actually decided that one of the roles of the labor movement was to become an investor and have set up, we have two labor pension funds, one which is a $15 billion fund, the other is a $2 billion fund that has been oriented towards job creation and elements of what we now call the just transition. But it's really been a very important piece of learning from us in Quebec is the whole issue of the ecosystem. Can you just go on to the next slide, Andrea, please?
Yeah.
So I think that's really, listening to Colin talk about community, that's the way we've worked, and we've been able to do that by creating a network at a national level, the Quebec-wide level, that is now recognized by government as being, the interlocutors to be able to advance public policy, to advance, the conditions, the necessary conditions for the just transition. I think that the other thing is Vonda, you talked about the issue of place-based. It's been very much organized on the place-based kind of, and even on a role of subsidiarity, in the sense of saying, what we have to do is create local ecosystems, regional ecosystems, national ecosystems, but whatever can be done at a local level on a territorial basis should be done that way. And that has also been very successful in creating the conditions. Colin talked about the partnership with a big enterprise and the local community. Well, that's the way we sort of built this movement over the years. I think that one of the key elements, can we move to the next slide, Angie? Having trouble doing it?
Can you
not happening.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. So as I say, so we're at a stage right now where the social economy and this, which, as I say, has another approach to the finality of what economic development is all about, is recognized now by government, labor, municipalities, the private sector, social movements. We even have what we call framework legislation in Quebec that was voted unanimously by the National Assembly that recognized this as an element, a fundamental infrastructure of our economy, and means that representatives of the social economy are participating in social dialogue, as I said, at a local, regional, national level. And we're also part of international networks, but we don't have time to get into that one. But once that's said and done, I think that from the capital perspective, obviously all, right through the development of this movement, the role of capital has been crucial. When we're talking about development, money is in the heart, le nerf de la guerre, as we say in French, it's the heart of the thing. And so, we have worked very closely and have built, and perhaps you can go on to the next slide, a certain number of tools over the years to respond to the needs. I mean, that's the Chantier, the organization, as I said, that I'm part of, but we can move on to the next one. is we've built certain kinds of tools, and every time, as you see, we started in 1990. Well, actually, the first local development fund I created with the Quebec Solidarity Fund was in 1988 for a local community, and but the one that we did specifically on what we call social economy enterprises, on collective enterprises that have a mission of giving, shall we say, the return on investment is to the community. We started very small, with small, non-guaranteed loans for nonprofits and co-ops, and everybody said we were crazy people. And 20 years later, we've been able to show, that sort of was more our demonstration project, showing that you can. And on the contrary, it's one of in that Crano, our loss rate is the lowest, much lower than more traditional businesses. And I don't have time to go into that. We built a patient capital fund in 2007 because we realized that these enterprises were growing, needed more equity. We've been working with investors, on all kinds of new tools. But I think the basic thing that we've learned is that we've always worked on this from the demand side, is that we're not having, people with experts in finance sitting down in some office somewhere and deciding what's good for our communities, our sectors, or the people who are actually doing these, creating these enterprises, but always, starting from what is the need, how can we invent, how can we innovate and create new kinds of financial instruments that are going to allow this, what we talk about as the just transition. And I guess, that has been really the fundamental way that we have worked, is around ecosystems, around partnerships, and really from analyzing and building new financial products from a bottom up, needs analysis and the demand side. Obviously, and that's why the ecosystem is so important, because often those kinds of things are going to need, partnerships with the public sector, new regulation, new public policy. Obviously, we need training, we need capacity building. So the ecosystem has really been the basis on which we've been able to build these financial tools that have broken ground. And we're really at the point now, which is why it's so interesting to hear people like Colin and Vonda talk of scaling this up, because now we're in the, we had 500,000 people here in the streets in Montreal a few weeks ago, demonstrating we have to get into this transition at a much quicker pace. But I would say that we are well equipped to do it because of the capacity building and because of this interest that has grown amongst investors.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. It must be interesting for you to see that progression, as you say, from coming from the actual social enterprises who are struggling with the lack of transition and sort of seeing the full circle to where we're now seeing this come from the finance and the institutions, and having them try and find the pathway down to the grassroots and to the actual social enterprises that are requiring the support. I'm wondering, I had 3 questions for you, Nancy, and we haven't gone through all of your slides, but so we might want to just sort of go through the next couple of slides and see if there's anything else you wanted to share with us. But the 3 questions I had for you, one was to share what happened, but the other was, what in terms of what you've learned from your experience in working in social economy and social enterprise and what was the just transition? What do you think we need to stop doing? And I'll speak from the investors, the socially conscious investors' perspective, who want to support and encourage the just transition.
Yeah, well, I think that it's sort of a funny question, but again, we can take it what to do or what not to do. But I think that really, the first thing is always to remember that our society will not change. This, the dominant thinking and what is stopping the just transition is not going to change just with a few experts and a few enlightened leaders. It's got to be, we need to be able to mobilize, social movements, mobilize, the business sector as well, get governments to change policy as mentioned. And that means that it can't be just a few, enlightened people or experts. This is not an issue for experts. This is the need for a broad movement. So, one of the things I think that foundations certainly, can play an important role in supporting the capacity of civil society to dialogue, to make sure that we have these places where, we talk about social innovation being important. I think it applies definitely to finance, that we need to innovate in new financial projects. Well, that kind of innovation comes out of collective intelligence. It's not some, it doesn't come out of somebody isolated in a laboratory. Social innovation is learning by doing. So we have to have those kinds of spaces, and I think that's where foundations, for example, can play a really interesting role, because they can invest, but they can also support civil society, and those are going to be developing this transitioned economy, around the table to create those kinds of spaces and find ways of doing things. And I think that's really important. What one should not do, and what we're all often concerned with, and we see it to a certain extent now, is that there is this tendency to for some people to say, well, this is really a field for experts. Even social innovation, when I was started to do stuff, I'm considered a social innovation. It was just called good common sense. It wasn't working. We had to try to find another solution. All of a sudden, it becomes social innovation. Everybody's talking about it, and it becomes a affair of experts, of people. But the experts in social innovation are those who are in the community, living in the communities, or working in the union, in the workplaces, and so on. So I think that what not to do is to think that a top-down approach is going to help make this happen. What to do, therefore, is to help create capacity, to help create those spaces, to be part of the discussion, to share knowledge, and I think we're getting closer and closer to that. And I would say the last thing that really has to be done, or and it's linked to not leaving all the space for the experts, is leave room for young people. We have a whole generation. People coming into my generation. We were stuck. That's the role for business. That's the role for government. That's the role for for charity. And young people are coming out of business schools with all kinds of stuff. Let them come in and take a lot of space, because they're shaking us up, but they were the ones who were out in the street. And we were with them, but as I say, they were out in the street last Friday, and I think we have to give them lots of space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And actually, that's a perfect segue. I think we want to open it up for some questions. I don't know if we have any young people on the line. I know that I no longer count as one.
Well,
But
I think
do we have some questions that have come in?
Yeah, we do have a few questions, and just to remind people, you can put your questions into the chat box. Please do so. We're opening up now to questions. If you want the question to be directed to someone in particular, let us know. I do think it is very interesting listening to the three speakers. Nancy talked about demand-driven financial products, which I think is very, very interesting, starting with the communities on the ground and where the need is, and actually designing products to meet those. Certainly not the norm in the investment management industry and the investment product development industry. But we also heard from Vonda and from Colin about the need for multi-stakeholder engagement, and the need, Nancy spoke about the role foundations can play in terms of a convener, bringing these different players together. And one of the questions that has come through here is, how can foundations undertake consultations with those most affected by a low carbon transition? So what does that actually look like to engage in those consultations? And maybe I'll start with Vonda. If you can maybe, and I'll encourage our presenters to provide punchy responses and brief responses if possible, so we can get to the many more questions that are coming through.
Okay, so I guess I will just invite whoever asked the question to join us when we have our multi-stakeholder dialogue with utilities in December, or to learn from our process. We're going to have a first day where we'll hear from worker stories and impacted community stories. Investors will then, with those participants, take that to companies for a day of discussion of both the process for decarbonization as well as the just transition. So I think it's really just the role for foundation is to get out there and participate. And if you don't know where or how, I bet Shannon has some ideas, given the breadth of the Share network in Canada. But I think any of us would welcome a chance for people to sit alongside of us. And then I just think also, to lift up Nancy's point, I really appreciated what you said about investors not having the answers. I think that those of us who, I don't know if it's just investors or if it's their sort of this expertise environment that we all live in, foundations, I think, are part of that too, where we're supposed to know how to do it. I think we have to say we don't know, and get out there and be part of the work on the ground and listen, which is probably not our usual mode.
Thank you, Vonda. Colin, do you want to jump in there and just talk about that role of consultation and any experience Friends Provident have had with that? Are you muted, Colin? Maybe you've muted yourself. Damon, can you? There you go.
That's it now. We've been working with grant recipients actually, because they're closer to the communities than we are, and also with the community energy movement, which is firmly grounded in communities. We've just started a piece of engagement with RACS, which has some large biomass and gas plant in the Yorkshire region, which is where we're based. And we're reaching out actually currently to community groups to basically get their take on it, along with the unions that are connected to those plants as well. So we get those two perspectives on how they themselves want to be brought into the whole process of identifying solutions and ensuring a just transition.
If I can,
Yes,
and I'll
Nancy,
just jump in
please.
quickly. I would say two things really quickly. I think the first thing is a key word is not consultation, but co-construction. You know, we've been talking about this, for example, in terms of public policy. You know, we have very advanced public policy in Quebec. It has all been a process of co-construction. It has never come from government, who's enlightened government that has sort of come up with a great idea. On the contrary. So I think that, you know, we have to go beyond consultation and get into co-construction of building, because that's where we're going to find the answers together. That's what innovation is all about. The second thing is I lost my other. Oh yeah, it's knowledge transfer. I think that, you know, around the world, you know, and there's no reason why we can't do that, but we need to spend time. There are so many people have found all kinds of solutions. I mean, it's out there, and you know what Colin was talking about, what Vonda's talking about, what we're doing. People don't know, and so they have to start, you know, from the beginning. And so if we can build the kinds of tools where we can transfer knowledge and learn from each other, but not just, again, experts, but communities. And we've been able to build, you know, those kinds of tools. Government's been investing in knowledge, you know, transferring knowledge and technological innovation for commercialization, for making money, but social innovation, transferring, learning from these innovations across the world is really, really important. And if people are interested, we have one now with Seoul, with big cities, Seoul and Barcelona and Mexico City and Montreal and so on. But we're learning from each other, and that's going to accelerate also our capacity for that transition.
And I thought it was interesting, Vonda, that you mentioned sort of storytelling. I think that there's also a different kind of knowledge transfer that needs to happen potentially. And I'm just this is more of a question, but it seems to me that actually the role of narrative and storytelling and actually sharing contextualized experiences beyond the traditional investment data is very powerful in this situation. Is that something that people would agree with?
Yeah, I think we need both. I mean, I think we're trying to figure out the sort of metrics and the data and how to look at it as an investor, because that's kind of how our world works, and we do need those. We have a lot of things to build on, and then we also need to have those dialogues, as people have talked about, but also build relationships, because I think that it's very hard to really understand what's happening. You know, just to give you an example, in the US in particular, I don't know if it's the same thing, I'm afraid probably it is in Canada, but there's, you know, a job in the coal mine or in the tar sands, you know, might pay $65 an hour with benefits and health and safety standards, and a job installing solar panels pays $12 to $15. And so when people talk about the transition and they think about renewables and how great we can make the seamless transition out of coal and into renewables, it's not that simple. And we actually heard from a worker at an investor conference that was sponsored by the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, who told that story about a worker who had been in one industry and was offered the opportunity for this job. And I think that makes it very real for people to hear that, and to understand that, you know, what may sound good as a soundbite, you know, we're going to transition workers from this to that. It in reality doesn't work like that, and we're not going to get there unless we engage them and hear from them.
Absolutely. There was a call out here that I'd just like to express, Nancy, particularly to you. Thank you from the Gen Y staff and the Gen Z students at the Youth and Philanthropy Initiative Canada. So an appreciation there for this idea of the space and the leadership that needs to be allowed from the younger generation. So I just wanted to make sure I shared that with the.
And if I just make a point on that, in Quebec, our university student associations are more and more involved in investing. And, you know, they've set up the student cooperative housing fund, they're investing their own funds, and they're into, you know, forcing their economic departments and their management to teach things differently. So it's absolutely, I mean, that's building for the long term, but of course we have to accelerate.
Absolutely. So I think we just have 4 minutes left, and just a couple of things we wanted to go through before people start heading off. I want to thank Vonda, Colin, Nancy. I know it seemed like such a short moment to be able to share your experiences, but I actually think that there were these very interesting threads in all the presentations, and I really appreciate the work you're all doing, the time that you took to be with us here today, and of course your ongoing commitment and example that you're providing to all of us. We just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense from the perspective of Foundation Investing 2.0. Here are some resources. Sorry, we will circulate these by email and others, any others. But these are the resources that Vonda was mentioning, the investor guide to the just transition, and we will make those available to you by email and when we send the slides also. In terms of some opportunities coming up, the Philanthropic Foundations of Canada have their 2019 symposium very shortly next week in Calgary. We have 2 in-person events coming up where we'll be looking at lots of different things, both in terms of governance and sort of policy setting for foundations, but also how to move into that total portfolio approach in a similar way that Colin was able to touch on today. And so those are 2 in-person all-day workshops. One is on November 14th in Vancouver, the other is November 19th in Toronto. Rally and Share will be leading those together. We'll have some brilliant external storytellers joining us as well. There are still some spots left, but it's filling up quickly, so we encourage people to register. And any additional information, please feel free to reach out to myself and or Andrea. I also just wanted to share, we'll be building on the topic today of just transition at the Share Investor Summit, which is taking place February 19th to 21st in Vancouver. We'll actually be having a more in-depth lab looking at just transition and looking at some practical hands-on solutions that we can take forward in each of our communities. So I really encourage folks to come out to that. We'll also be addressing lots of other issues, including the climate crisis, including inequality, including new business models and innovations in corporate governance. We're bringing together foundations with pension funds and Indigenous trusts and universities across the country. So that's also part of the Foundation Investing 2.0. We're really excited that Rally is joining us there to host a masterclass for foundations, and that will be a full day skills-based workshop on the February 19th. So that's the close. Andrea, I've left you 1 minute to contribute any closing thoughts or comments that you have. So I'll hand it to you.
Well, I just want to thank, again, echo the thanks to Vonda, Colin, and Nancy, both for your work and also for joining us today. I'm so pleased that people have attended, and thank everyone on the call. We could actually open up the lines once more, and wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day. And we hope to see you at one of the next webinars, events, tweets, links. And so
All
thank you. And we got the lines open, and we can just sort of say a hello, a goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, speakers. Thank you, everyone.
And hope that this will be the beginning of the conversation, not the end.